Today, though, we have a real treat. Despina Kakoudaki is Associate Professor in the Department of Literature at American University at Washington, D.C. And she teaches a number of different courses and researches in a number of different ways in cultural studies and science fiction, apocalyptic narratives, everything and the kitchen sink, it seems. Very, very good stuff. But we know her in this field for her, I think, wonderful book, which, by the way, is available down in the King's Bookstore, Anatomy of a Robot, Literature, Cinema, and a Cultural Work of Artificial People. So we're going to talk about artificial people today. Yesterday, she gave the opening short introduction to the Frankenstein celebration film, or a play at Dalhousie, Drums and Organs. And so some of you that saw that know that you're in for a real treat. I'm going to leave it to Despina to take it away into artificial people.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. Let me know if this is too loud or not loud enough, because the microphone is kind of on the side. So what I wanted to talk about today is something that is part of my research in relation to Frankenstein and politics and artificial people, and partly also new in terms of thinking of new texts like Ex Machina and Westworld, which always revise but also revitalize some of the metaphors that we have about artificial people. And the poster is based on my book cover, which is an analysis of the trope, the figure of the artificial person, as something that is very, very focused on the fictional tradition, but also takes the fictional tradition in new directions, by recognizing, for example, that fictions and imaginary versions of the artificial person are transhistorical. They're not necessarily aligned specifically with the scientific revolution. They're not even specifically aligned with science. They pre-exist all of these contemporary technological and scientific understandings. And so I ended up devising the book in relation to what would be the fundamental ingredients of this story, which is so dispersed that it's everywhere. And I identified a couple of particular ingredients that are coming from the ancient world, like the fact that artificial people are constructed and not born, right? Or they are born in an artificial way. And the fact that we imagine mechanical bodies, and then seeing how those ingredients move into a more modern vocabulary of mechanical slaves, or animation and de-animation as a type of existential locus. So the issue here, in terms of looking at something like Frankenstein or Westworld or robots or cyborgs, and I know that some of you are students of this topic, of this discourse, is that the stuff is everywhere. It's very dispersed, it's very uncontrollable, it's very slippery, and popular culture is actually a very, very paradoxical object of study. Things in popular culture, because it is a collective product, right? Popular culture is created by all of us. When something is on our minds, it emerges in popular culture very quickly. It's like as if the popular culture has collective antennas. And so something that is worrying us about technology or about the future, about the definition of humanity, it emerges very quickly in popular culture. On the other hand, however, popular culture never gets rid of things, right? Nothing ever goes away. So you have patterns and styles and story types that are hundreds or thousands of years old, and they still have perfect applicability and relevance today. And so when we're looking at robots, we're looking at both something new, and something that always promises the new, but we're also looking at something that has really long life, a long life in human civilization. And my idea in this book was, instead of being bothered, which I really am, about how stereotypical this discourse is, how much it replicates the same plots again and again, to actually treat the stereotype as something that could be readable, something that could be meaningful, and to look through the stereotype at what are the things that stay the same in this discourse, what are the things that are sticky, right? What are the things that we always keep reminding ourselves about or returning to. So for example, some of the most chestnutty chestnuts, so this discourse like artificial people would be born adult and they would be designed to be slaves. Those are annoying when you're looking for a completely new text, but they can also be meaningful. Why do we keep returning to these tropes or these treatments or these fictional patterns? So the Frankenstein mythos is functional very intensely in this discourse. And what I want to talk about today is how to understand this politically as something that has provided quite a lot of energy to, or encapsulated a certain energy about the artificial person into much more modern discourses. So this isn't a narrative about where Mary Shelley got some of the political ideas that are transmitted in Frankenstein, although there is quite a lot of magnificent research and scholarship about that. It's about how to read the book structurally in order to actually see where the political energy comes from. And that political energy, for me, hinges on how we understand animation, how we understand the creation of an artificial person, and what we understand as the cycle of animation and de-animation that I think activates the book. So the famous scene of the activation of the monster, the animation of the monster in Frankenstein, I'm using the 1931 images because they are so fun. In a way, it is the thing that we all remember, and the scene that seems to be so central to the story. And I will talk a little bit more about the characteristics and the structural patterns of animation in stories of artificial people in general. But in fact, what I argue in this presentation and this article that I'm writing is that animation is actually a double process in Frankenstein, and also therefore a double process in quite a lot of our narratives. And if the first stage is to think about animating something, making something come to life, right? The second stage is a type of strange translation or transposition of mysteries. Victor Frankenstein famously tries to find the secrets of nature in animating the monster. What is the difference between death and life, right? And in revealing these secrets, he actually also creates completely new mysteries. And those mysteries are not about making life, but about unmaking life, about rejection, about political exile, about social death. And in a way, I'm using these two images in order to show the kind of animation versus confrontation narrative, which is when the monster meets him up in the mountains and basically asks to be recognized, or asks to be taken seriously, asks to be accepted. So something about making and unmaking people is the handle that I'm trying to use in order to understand the double process of animation. So what happens in the novel, if you look at the language, is that the language of animation and de-animation infects everything. All of the bodies of the novel are subject to this language, and I have a couple of examples that I will give you. There are quite a lot of descriptions of people being lifeless or de-animated or catatonic, of people being unresponsive and then being roused into enthusiasm or hysterical energy. And if you start noticing them, you'll see that the book itself has a strange circularity of the heights of intensity, the lowest points of depression. It actually is very intense as a book and very melodramatic in a way, in this kind of continuum. And there are effects in having this idea of a circularity of life and death, or a circularity of animation and catatonic states, which are both epistemological and political. So here are some of the examples. Victor Frankenstein, he loses all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. And then he has a fever, but then he's stimulated by this unnatural stimulus into frantic, frenzied activity. Walton says he has basically fallen into apparent lifelessness, and they have to rouse him into animation by rubbing him with brandy. He also himself, Walton, the polar explorer that is part of the narration of the book, he also has this intense states of being vivid and fervent in his enthusiasm, and then also thinking that he's going to die, and he's totally depressed and he cannot really do anything, and then next time he glows with enthusiasm. So all of this vocabulary is coming around in the book a lot. And all of the language is very intensely motivated and moving. It has moving parts, it has intense mobility. So for example, the characters are possessed by joy. These are all quotes from the book. Driven into despair, animated by enthusiasm, lifeless, then roused into action, then absorbed by melancholy, then invigorated by courage, overwhelmed by rage. Like you have to imagine like a kind of hysterical cyclicality, right, in the book of life and death as states that affect all the bodies in the book. In fact, the monster is the only one who gets affected by this only once, when he is a lifeless collection of matter and gets animated into an animate being. And so there's something about the language itself giving us an example between the metaphorical use of a word, like I am lifeless, versus the science fiction literal use of that word, which is the monster is lifeless and is roused into animation. Literally, he comes to life. Right? And this is a really interesting paradigm recognition about how a word might function in a science fiction context versus in an everyday metaphorical or Gothic context in which we're not really using it as a literal effect. So here's one of the passages that I think is really very important. Victor, in order to understand animation, he studies the life and death, and he basically starts from death. He starts from the natural decay and corruption of the human body. And this is the passage of his description of part of his research. He says, I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness a sudden light broke upon me and I understood the mystery of animation, and then I was able to bestow it on matter, and then you know the story from there. But the thing that I love about this passage is that he has this very quick sleight of hand that says, oh, I studied it from life to death and from death to life. What's the part of the death to life? What is the part that could be observable about death to life? Right? Life to death you can see. In fact, life to death is a very, very active, intense ecosystem. Scientists talk about it as a cadaveric ecosystem in which things start deteriorating, things start being absorbed by enzymes, by scavengers, by decomposition processes, things start devolving into their, into cartilage or into carbon or into liquids, right? That is a very active, intense process, the most fascinating process for medieval alchemists, for example, who found in corruption and putrefaction the most intense realization of the materiality and the transformability of matter. That is what shows you decay, shows you how powerful matter is. But if you're going to go with this alchemical idea about matter and transformability, you cannot have any sense of particularity. Because again, enzymes, bacteria, plants, certain insects can do this death to life part, but you cannot actually remake that same organism again, right? Matter does not disappear, matter does not dissipate, matter is transformable and continuous in that cycle, but matter never comes back to the same form as it was before. And so that is the sleight of hand in the novel that actually reveals to us, first of all, a slightly alchemical imagination in the book, not because of the experiments he makes, but because of the assumptions about matter that he has, right, that Victor has, or the desires that he has for a circularity of matter. And also you can see how the idea of circulation and circularity play into the novel in trying to both reverse something, but also imagine an infinite horizon of constant cyclical reversibility. So what we see in the novel is this idea of what I understand as a problematic idea of over-focusing on the question of origin, where does life come from, even though the motivating engine of the book is actually death-related. It's not life-related, it's death-related, and the book has an incredible death drive. And when Mary Shelley reinvents the book in 1831 and makes edits and writes a new introduction, she also highlights that question of origin. She also goes exactly in those same places to give her attention, to kind of direct her attention to the question of how animation might happen, how the monster might be animated. And the questions that she asks are very similar to the questions that Victor asks. So some of the things that I'm arguing here is that what we see in the 1818 edition of the book is a slightly mysterious process in which both the mystery of animation and the mystery of rejection are a little bit unsolvable, right? We don't really have examples or reasons why Victor has such an incredible reaction to the monster, why he recoils, why he disappears, why he rejects the monster so much. It's part of the mystery of the book, part of the thing that gives it a lot of relevance, I think, for a lot of things about injustice or rejection. But what happens when Mary Shelley re-edits the book in 1831, and she actually tries to interpret exactly this. She interprets why Victor would be upset and why he would reject the monster, and she does it by making a moral proclamation. And the quote here is, he looks at the thing that he has created and he recoils. And of course he recoils because frightful must it be, right? Must it be? For supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. And she has added God in it, and God has not been there before in the previous edition. And she has added hubris, right? And hubris was not there in 1818. And Victor was just a researcher who was trying to do wacko experiments, and this had nothing to do with trying to become God or mocking God. So she directs her attention to, I know that this is bad, and I'm telling you this is bad, and it was a type of hubristic, overreaching exercise. But she also gives us a reading of the book. Of course he rejects the monster, of course. Because it is an abomination, it is the unnatural, it is monstrous. So those two are really important in thinking about what happens in the novel from 1818 to 1831. And then I think that the third thing that's really important is that if we actually focus on rejection, instead of saying, how is the creature created, right? Instead of the fetishism of animation, let's think about the second part of the animating story, which is the rejection, the de-animation of the monster. And in a snapshot, sometimes I describe it as the monster is made through science and unmade through political rejection, right? Unmade, isolated, rejected, dehumanized, all of those things that are taking away whatever qualities of sociality a full-fledged human might have in a context. But what I think the rejection focus allows us to see is two completely new mysteries, which aren't the mysteries of animation, they are the mysteries of the rejection. And one of the mysteries is, why does Victor recoil? If it is not related to pious fear and horror, why does he recoil? And to answer that, you almost need psychological and psychoanalytic language to understand his hysteria, which itself gives us a sense that he has some strange place of a deep motivation that isn't really clear or logical or intellectual in some other place, right? Psychological or psychoanalytic place. And the second thing is, why is the monster rejected? If you take away the idea the monster is rejected because the monster is artificial, if you take that away, the why gives us a sense that actually there is no reason why the monster would be or not be included into the human, because these categories are abstract, political, and in fact quite capricious in the way that they might be grounded or withheld. Right? Something is being withheld. So the project of defining the human in that sense is not about birth. It's not about being made in a particular way. It is about the abstractions of political definition. Right? That somebody could say, in this context I have certain rights. When I go to get a driver's license, I might have a completely different set of rights. When I go down and walk in the street, I might have a different set of rights, including different sets of vulnerabilities. Right? Am I always the same vis-a-vis the state? Right? These are the places where abstract definitions of sociality and political belonging exist that have nothing to do with ontology. Right? They have nothing to do with how you make people. So the monster, in fact, is extremely aware of this. The monster's demand is always for a type of social and political understanding of where he fits. He does not have any ontological answers for himself. He doesn't say, oh, I know, it's because I'm artificial. At the very most, he says, I understand that I'm stronger than you guys. I understand that I'm faster than you guys. I understand that I don't look like you guys. And still, I don't understand why I am always to be wretched. I don't understand why I am always to be isolated. And in fact, what he says is that his happiness and his virtue are dependent on this idea of acceptance. If you could accept me into the human fold, I would be virtuous and good. It is my isolation and my rejection that are making me violent. So with that start in terms of Frankenstein, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what the politics of animation actually are. What do we mean when we talk about animation in these narratives, in narratives of artificial people? And in my book, I actually tried to study it in as early of a context as possible by looking at ancient myths, origin stories, and some of the mythological backgrounds where the gods create people out of inanimate materials. So artificial people in general usually are born adult. There are very few examples of artificial children, and even the artificial children conform to some of the tendencies of the artificial body narrative, which is they might not grow, right, or they might not evolve. It's a very interesting thing in the classic tradition. The artificial story makes a double reversal of both birth and death, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a sense. And artificial people, because they are born adult, they're born into immediate functionality, right? You create adult people in order for them to be immediately able to work, right? To occupy positions that have requirements or that have a particular labor functionalities. They are instrumental. So when in a scene like, for example, the scene from Metropolis, we do have this sense of the adult body ready and waiting for its animation, and all of the qualities that you need, like language or cognition or motion, immediately given, like a switch, right, like a switch on a button. Instead of a baby that has to grow and develop all those things over time, the adult body is animated, it arrives into all of these things. It also arrives into gender, very importantly, because adult bodies have gender markers, right? And in a way, because of that, because the body is adult, because it arrives into gender, it also arrives into gendered forms of labor, which is why artificial men are often imagined as artificial slaves, artificial workers, artificial soldiers, very specifically gendered jobs. And artificial women are often imagined as sexual objects, perfect wives, or perfect sexual partners, objectified in a completely different way, again, in terms of a type of labor narrative. The artificial birth narrative is also really very interesting in terms of its sequencing, and this is where I'm talking about the way that animation reverses certain aspects. So if you look at this, for example, the adult body as a birth model, it takes everything that is inside in the human gestation, and brings it outside. Instead of waiting for 9 months and hoping that something good comes out, right? And which in medieval times or Renaissance times was a huge mystery, what is going on in the womb where the baby is growing, right? Everything that is inside comes outside and becomes visible and immediate at the press of a button almost. What we have with this other animating part is a reversal of death. So this is a scene from Bicentennial Man, and what you have, if you read it according to the arrow, is the animating story, the activation story. Somebody comes with a truck, brings in a box, and the box is a robot. They turn on the robot basically starts focusing. This is the robot's point of view, pixelated. And then the robot arrives into the society, has a name, and it arrives into this family and has a function and a position within that world. Now if you play it backwards, this is a death scene. Somebody who has a name and a functionality and a social context starts losing focus, starts forgetting their name, becomes inert, and then we put them in a box and take them out of the house. I'm sorry to be so literal, this is almost gross. But the death scene is actually a reversal in terms of directionality from what the animating scene then supplies. It supplies a narrative of things acquiring life rather than losing life. Right? Acquiring qualities instead of losing qualities. And the key is that we are looking at an adult body in both of those cases, right? So the double reversal of animation is the inside comes outside and death and birth are reversed, right? The directionality is reversed. So because of that, we have this connection to purpose, as I was saying before, and because artificial people are born adult, they immediately occupy these particular social positions. So purpose, enslavement, instrumentality, being a cog in a machine, all of those things really actually flow from the idea that the body is born adult. They are people who are supposed to be babies, like new to the world, right? Brand new people, but in fact they have none of the privileges and none of the protections, either of adults in a particular social context, or of children who need to be protected or brought up or educated. And in fact, the narrative is so strong that we have stories of immediate, like it's so strong to talk about enslavement that in something like Battlestar Galactica, you don't even have to explain the story. The Cylons were created by men, they were created to be slaves, and then they rebelled. Like, you know, really like first, second intertitle, within 3 seconds the story's done. You know why all of this is happening, the stereotype is so strong. It needs no explanation. But what that allows us to see is it allows us to see the narrative in which we are looking at a double cycle that in contemporary political terms has taken on this problem of animation and given it political meaning. And we love the stories in which we have a robot, like in the Bicentennial Man, who through processes of legal emancipation becomes a person, right? The emancipation process in which an object becomes a subject. But this part of the story also hides another part of the story in which a person is reduced into an object. Right? So the cyclicality that I'm recognizing in Frankenstein actually characterizes quite a lot of the fantasies of the artificial body. To imagine the person and the object as something that creates two completely different dynamic dimensions. Right? If I say that I am being objectified, it's as if you go into one direction. If you say that a robot acquires rights, you go into the other direction. So the two parts of the cycle, basically, I think, mean that the animating story in modernity is related to politics, or has been interpreted politically, or it gives some particular metaphors for our political vocabulary. Coming to life, acquiring rights, becoming a subject, becoming a person, all of those vocabularies are really active, and they use the animating story in order to be useful. But as a warning somewhere, I want us to remember that the story always has two parts. So the emancipation part also hides the objectification part. And in fact, if we're going to celebrate the top part of the cycle in which the object becomes a subject, we have to remember that somewhere else, the other side of the cycle is also happening. And in fact, it's happening quite often, which is the subject being treated as an object. Right? And all of these vocabularies of disenfranchisement, enslavement, all of these are in the second part of the cycle. So I'll give you an example from Ex Machina, for example, which is really very interesting. In Ex Machina, you have these two guys who are trying to play the Turing test basically on an artificial woman named Eva, and to think about whether she's conscious enough or whether she's self-aware enough to be considered human, to be considered that she is passing the Turing test. The story has a lot of surprises and a lot of contemporary materials, and in fact it actually makes a big case out of presenting Eva as somebody who's really very, like a young woman, as somebody who's very sentimental in some ways, who's very cognizant, but also representing her in physicality, in physical terms, as truly artificial, as really artificial. You see her insides and wires and things like that. In fact, that isn't necessarily necessary in that story because, as we will see, other artificial people of that world have skin, so why couldn't she have skin? And my argument would be that then you wouldn't have a test at all. She would just be human and that would be the end of it. So as the story progresses, Eva manipulates both of these men and she manages to escape from this place. And we see the narrative of subjectification, where she starts by being an object that needs to be evaluated, and by the end she basically creates a kind of a human female identity and leaves the house, and she manages to escape in an almost animalistic moment of survival and leaving everything behind and working her way through this maze where the experiment is happening. On the other hand, however, the story has another woman who starts out by us being considered, as viewers, being considered completely human. Her name is Kyoko, and she is actually presented as the helper, right? The person who might be a domestic worker or a sexual object or a sexual partner, or all of these things at the same time. She doesn't speak, and the narrative gives different ideas. No, she doesn't speak English, or no, she doesn't speak. But in fact, she is also an artificial woman, and she has passed all the possible tests. She's already passed all the tests. We arrive at this house and we're like, okay, let's go. There is no fetishism there about is she human or isn't she human. She starts human, right? And in a way, there's something interesting about having the second position in the story where this woman, under quite a lot of baggage of how we objectify women in general, how we might objectify young women, how we might sexualize Asian women, all of this stuff that is actually allowing the story to say, oh, that's just Kyoko, and of course that's what she does, and of course she doesn't speak English, so don't worry about it, and you don't have to talk to her. There's all of these strange things that we somehow allow to be possible because those are part of the range of how we treat people in the real world. They're not new, they're not science fiction, they're just like, oh yeah, that's just Kyoko. At some point it's very clear that the two women are both artificial. They somehow collude or collaborate in some way. The narrative is so destabilizing that everybody in the story starts worrying that they themselves are artificial, including one of our characters who starts trying to cut himself, because if artificial people could be that real, there's no safe space. There's no safe place, right? If you look like Eva in the beginning, where you have visible mechanisms, well, you know that Eva is not real. She's not human. But if you look like Kyoko, nothing is safe. Anybody could be artificial. And in fact, because Kyoko has been so human, we have to actually figure out how to dehumanize Kyoko through the story towards the end. Whereas on the other hand, we see Eva humanizing herself by basically constructing a female identity out of the detritus of what patriarchy has done to women. She actually opens a closet and she finds all the previous models that this guy has developed, other women of all kinds of races and body sizes and body styles, and she starts picking pieces from them in order to make herself have skin, in order to make herself succeed in the world. And then she actually creates really quite normative version of herself, very pretty, very ingenue, very youthful, very stylish, high heels, long hair, and she leaves the house in order to kind of completely blend into human society. But what I want us to remember from the story is that we have actually seen both the conscious overt narrative of Eva's humanization, but we have also implicitly seen the narrative of Kyoko's dehumanization, right? Her revelation of being non-human and the violence that needs to happen onto her by the narrative in order for that dehumanization to be official. A similar thing happens in Westworld, and what happens in Westworld is that the artificial people of Westworld are so human-like and so articulate, and the process in which we relate to them is so intensely psychological and about psychological categories that at some point it almost doesn't seem to be any reason to have that distinction between humans and non-humans. In fact, I think that the story makes the non-humans super interesting and much more interesting than the humans, because the humans only want 2 or 3 things. They want to come to Westworld in order to have escapades, to have a lot of sexual experimentation, to hurt people, or to have rape fantasies, or fantasies of being a sheriff, I don't know. But it's like 10 little perversions. It's like a very limited list, in fact, of perversions that the humans have. Whereas the artificial people, the hosts of the story, have a really long range of what they desire, what they are dealing with, what they want. I gave an interview today for the radio station here in Halifax, and I was talking about where the real robots are in Westworld, and the real robots are these guys. These are robots that are actually made by a company called KUKA, K-U-K-A, and they are actually the robots that are working in automotive factories and materials handling and palletizing. And those are real. The real ones are orange because they need to be visible on the factory floor. So the masquerade here is that these are white. But other than that, they are actually real applications. Everything else is part of a strange technological mise-en-scène that is about kind of hiding the fact that these artificial people are kind of like people. Including imagery about 3D printing, imagery about the kind of material that we imagine today in terms of 3D printing elements, and all of the vocabulary of a medieval anatomical imaginary that somehow is always reactivated in these stories. And in this, because they have such a lot of historical sensibility about this narrative, they bring that up a lot. So for example, we have imagery that is like a cabinet of curiosities, we have images that are about puppets and puppetry, we have imagery that is replicating a lot of stories from Frankenstein or a lot of stories from other stories of artificial people. It's a very meta kind of mise-en-scène. They bring back everything that we have ever loved about narratives of artificial people. Very historicist, very baroque, and also very specific in terms of its vocabulary. So what happens in the story is that we have the constant cycle, aggressively replicated, that I am describing, the making and unmaking of people. In fact, I don't know that we have enough making, we have a lot of unmaking. Every night, these artificial people, these hosts are wiped clean, their bodies are restored, their memory is erased, and they are launched again into this world to be traumatized and abused again. So you have a cycle of trauma, a cycle of abuse, that is where the story has most of its energy. And so it's not even just about the unmaking narrative as a narrative of making people into non-people. It's the unmaking narrative as unmaking the self, constantly undoing the self, right? Anything that acquires coherence about experience or about ego or about action and ethics is unmade every night. And these people are trying really hard to hold on to this possibility. So if you wanted to think about the Kyoko-Ava example that I gave you before, let me just see if I can bring up a slide to show you. With Kyoko, we can say that Kyoko gets objectified in the way that real women are objectified. She becomes a sexual object, she's treated as a servant, she's treated as somebody who doesn't matter in the story. That is the kind of everyday modes of objectification as a metaphorical process. Whereas Ava is a real object, right? She's an artificial person. She is mechanical. But the two forms of objectification coexist. And actually, they start infecting each other. Because Ava is going to become a beautiful young woman who actually welcomes her own objectification as a sexy young person. And Kyoko is going to be objectified as a real object. She's going to be revealed to be a real object. Right? But the deployment of objectification is radical in this. It's just like really quite complex. That both literal and metaphorical objectification happens in the story. And the same thing happens in Westworld. We have people that are designed to be objects. And so their abuse and their traumatization shouldn't matter because they're objects. But in fact, what the story produces is very complex characters that have quite a lot of feeling, and it produces the spectacle of repeated violation, repeated abuse, repeated genocide sometimes. You have scenes in which you walk through town and the whole town is full of corpses. That's bad. It's just really quite intense. And also spectacles of resistance. All of this, at some point, the programming doesn't work, the software changes, and they start remembering all the things that have happened to them. And by remembering, they basically create a human identity that is born out of trauma, and a kind of sensibility that is dehumanized because it has to have its own catatonic states in order to survive. It's like a really very complex idea about personality. Some of the spectacles that we have in the story are all the same spectacles that we see in other stories of linking the mechanical and the organic, or the mechanical and the artificial. And then we also have spectacles of abjection, of having these warehouses where all the previous models are living that are just standing there inert and naked to be used or not used depending on what the characters, what the narrative wants. All of these bodies that are decommissioned, disposable, right? People that are in reserve, on reserve. Like you might need them, you might use them some other time. It's a really, the imagery is very spectacular about objectification and about treating people as, people that are human as non-human. So what connects with these stories is a type of existential understanding of the artificial person that has been characteristic of most of the 20th century, let's say from the 40s and after, and really characteristic of the 21st century. If there used to be an ontological security in saying there are people and there are robots, and they are different and I can tell, right? And that is actually something that happens when you have a robot that is oversized, mechanical, metallic on the outside, that doesn't have language or that has very limited understanding of human culture. The classic Asimovian robot, basically, right? Where if that robot walks in the room, it is so clearly robotic, mechanical, other, that the rest of us might have a kind of a, what I call the ontological security, where all of the rest of us are much more naturally human. It's going to be very clear that there is a difference. That kind of difference at the level of ontology is also what we see in Frankenstein when the story insists on the visible, embodied difference of the monster, to say that the monster clearly looks other, right? So when the artificial person clearly looks other, you get that stabilization of the two positions where the human and the non-human are clearly visible and distinguishable. When the artificial person does not look other, you don't have that, right? You actually have an activation of the insecurity about what it means to be human. And also, you have a recognition that what the previous model was doing, the classical model was doing, was a type of a racial or racialist or racist epistemology. To say, for example, if we accept that politics is a type of abstract definition of humanity, and ontology is an embodied definition of humanity, to say that a robot walks in the room, and just by looking at the robot I can tell where the robot fits in a social and political hierarchy, that's a racialist principle, that's a racist principle. So just by looking at you, I know if you can vote. Right? Think about it. It's like the situations and the cultural contexts in which that is sayable are contexts that deploy a very racist epistemology about who belongs where and who has what rights. You should not be able to tell just by looking at someone what their position is in the political spectrum. But in fact, we have had quite a lot of social and cultural contexts in which that is the case. And I'll have some slides that show you this in a little bit. So instead of thinking about it as this absolute division between there are robots and there are people and I can tell, what we see in the existential model is you can't tell, and in fact the artificial might have more sensibility and more intense experience of being human than the human, which is the narrative we see in Frankenstein a little bit and definitely in Westworld. We say things about artificiality in everyday language. We say, I'm an automatic pilot today, or I feel like a robot, or whenever we complain about normativity or a repetition or our everyday life being oppressive, we might use the artificial vocabulary. And you know, one of the examples that I have here about this existential vocabulary is the Stepford Wives, which also has that kind of relationship that we see in Ex Machina. Right? The women that are feeling objectified by their culture become literal objects when the men of Stepford replace them by androids. We have a similar existential vocabulary in Blade Runner, where again the people, the supposedly real people of that world are quite boring, and the people who show sensibility and intensity and an understanding of experience and understanding of life are the replicants, right? And then, in fact, what we have in terms of Westworld is we have a different existential vocabulary, which is very characteristic of recent stories. And I have it as a phrase up there. I thought I was A, but now I know I am B. It's basically calling the bluff on the Cartesian definition of the self in this sense. Here's what I mean by this. To say, I thought I was human, but now I know I'm a robot. The structure of that phrasing means that the position of B, I thought I was human but now I'm a robot, the position of the robot has more self-consciousness because it knows its position in the social network, in the social system. It knows that it is artificial, whereas the human is a position of false consciousness, of not knowing where you belong in the system, right? So it's really fundamentally problematic because you can see how intensely existential that position is. It is more self-aware to know you are a robot than to think you are human. And this is the kind of manipulation that all of the stories use, and all the stories basically force us to consider what we imagine as the inherent stability of these two positions by destabilizing both of them, right? Thinking you are human is a delusion. And you know, like it creates immediately very thoughtful and very intense investigations. So what happens in Westworld is this bizarre complexity of either I'm losing my mind or this world is broken, this can't be happening, a lot of vocabulary about paranoia or schizophrenia, a lot of vocabulary about having memories that have been repressed that come back, the vocabulary of how the hosts of Westworld actually operate in terms of sensibility is a very intense psychological vocabulary with a lot of investments. And it also has a type of other aspects of video game structure, things like that. It also has its own repressed memory in bringing back images and figures from the Westworld from the 70s. That is like part of the nerdy satisfaction of those shows. The kind of inserting memories into the past, from the past to the present. It has a lot of varieties of spaces in which all of these things would happen, and none of the spaces are immune to this contradiction. None of the spaces are the purely human spaces. You cannot say, if I am on this space that looks like a very modern arrival hall, I know everybody's human. Actually, that's not true. So it's as if the artificial starts infecting everything. And in fact, nothing is securely human anymore. So that's the vocabulary that we are in now, right? That is the existential treatment of the artificial as something that might be performative, or something that might be attractive, or something that might be so extensive that there is no distinction between human and non-human anymore. This is part of some kind of code that is being used in the show. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about this distinction. We have one character, Maeve, who is exactly the best example of this idea, that she thought that she was a human, she understands her position in the system, she starts manipulating her position in the system. She actually acts like a very sovereign ego in that world, because she can start remembering, she knows how to die and come back and keep her memories. When she dies and comes back, she doesn't get erased somehow. And then all of that is being manipulated yet again, because we're not really sure if it is the program itself that allows her to have that. Like how much of that is her, how much of that is willed, how much of that is the programming. It is really layers within layers of destabilization. But her story is a story of abuse. It is a story of having her daughter killed. It is a story of seeing these kinds of incredible scenes of destruction of bodies. And her story is also a story of a type of psychological profiling, which is now quantifiable. This is supposed to be the software that they use in order to program how much initiative somebody has, how much loyalty somebody has, how much self-willingness. So it's like loyalty, aggression, curiosity, imagination, decisiveness, patience, right? A whole spectrum of ideas that imagine how the self is made, even though, in fact, the self in Westworld is made through unmaking. Right? The self in Westworld is made through abuse, trauma, violence, and the memory of all of those things, the memory of violence. These characteristics are part of the fetishism of we have ways to quantify who you are, but then in fact who they are is the products and the remnants and the survivors of all of this constant, endless violence. So this is, I'm coming back to the original idea about Frankenstein and all of this vocabulary. So what I am arguing is that if you focus on rejection, you realize what Mary Shelley has done, which is that when you make people, you have to jump into the imagination, into a science fictional world. Like, we don't exactly know how that worked, but trust me, it worked, and I made a person, right? I animated inanimate matter. So the making of people is a foray into the science fictional. The unmaking is every day. The unmaking is common. The unmaking of people is something we actually have experienced. And this explains a little bit where the energy of some of these texts comes in everyday life. You don't have to have made a person, but if you have been bullied in class, or if you have had difficult relationships with people, if you have been disenfranchised, if you don't really feel secure in your political situation, you know the unmaking, and you know the unmaking is real. So there's something interesting about recognizing how the existential and how the political come in. And so as a result of this, right, to think about the unmaking as being something we recognize, whereas the making is something we imagine, right? The two mysteries that I was talking about, which is why does Victor reject the monster? And you either have to say the monster is rejected because of who he is, or because of how he's made, and that's the racial epistemology that we might recognize in some of our texts. Or the monster is rejected for the same abstract reasons that anybody is rejected, which is the political, right? Which is the abstract political that makes arbitrary definition between who votes and who doesn't, and who can get financial aid and who doesn't, and who has a particular right to stand at a particular court and who doesn't, right? All of these things are abstract, they have nothing to do with ontology. And to think about it in racial terms, the way that sometimes they make a claim to ontology is exactly the racist premise. Like to say, you cannot stand in this court because you are Right? Whenever they make a claim to ontology instead of staying within abstraction, that's when you see the racialist premise at hand. So this is, I think, the connection that we can make. This is how we can, I think we can understand the unmaking from Frankenstein all the way to Westworld, and how we can actually recognize some of the political energy of that book. Thank you. And then questions.
That was totally excellent. We have lots of time now for questions, so I will come with the zipping up because we have to have it broadcast here. And so put your hand up and I'll come at you.
I can walk around too. Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
We talk a lot about Western, like most of the examples were from Western media in this talk. Do you think this sort of the presence of death and the definition of like the relationship between artificial humans and death is, do you think that's a particularly Western thing or a more universal thing?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think that the vocabulary that I'm analyzing here is definitely Western, and I talk about origin stories that I am familiar with, which are much more in the Western tradition, ancient Greek, Roman, Judeo-Christian. There is a lot in contemporary culture, however, that is coming from very different places, and you see a very different iconography and a very different dynamism in things that come out of Japan, let's say, where there is incredible focus on artificial or mechanical beings, and a very different notion of animism, a very different notion of what objects are and can do. One of the places where we see that in contemporary culture is actually we see that we are not able to sustain the old Western paradigm anymore, partly because of the globalization of these stories. On the one hand, you have the West to East transition, where some of the mechanical obsessions and styles arrive very easily in Japanese manga, for example. But on the other hand, you have a different representation of how cute or how connected and how relatable the artificial is, that is infecting the West with a completely new vocabulary. So yeah, I think that because culture, I think, really matters in these stories, I think that a deeper analysis is necessary, and I'm completely aware this is much more Western. But I think that the way to understand it might not really be about an absolute opposition, because these things are influencing each other constantly right now. But part of the issue is to not think about the artificial as the opposite. That is almost not possible anywhere right now. You would have to make a real, it would have to be a really perverse text to do that. I have not seen any text in which is so clear that the robot is a robot and you don't care. It's almost immediately absorbable into the human, and immediately sentimental, and immediately identifiable, and fascinating or cute or adorable. The other thing that where you can see that difference is in children's culture. Sometimes I have this thing about technoculture where the adult critics are like, the artificial is a challenge, and then you talk to children and it's like, I love robots, I am a robot, I feel like a robot all the time. And they have a completely different projection into the mechanical that isn't fearful at all. So I think that we have to be aware of our metaphors, and we have to do more of our range of research for this. Yeah?
So, in terms of these metaphors and the social context that we always imagine in science fiction tropes, do you feel like that the narrow canon of traditional science fiction has limited our ability to imagine robots as anything else at this point?
So tell me again a little bit. The traditional science fiction.
You can do it again.
Yeah.
So it seems like that there's a rather narrow canon that a lot of science fiction has started out in. Like books like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is very influential, and because of that, we continue to operate within a lot of the same paradigms or scenarios. Do you feel that that has limited our understanding of what science fiction will be or can be? Or has it allowed us to envision in new ways as it's recreated with different generations?
Yeah, I think that with science fiction and with all of these popular genres, you always have that sense of the tradition that is partly desirable. People love connecting to the older texts. Audiences love having a sense of familiarity. When the old gunslinger robot from the 70s Westworld comes on into the show, people like explode online, right? Oh, I recognize, like they love the recognition of the old, they love the homage to the old. So there's something about the self-replication of the canon that is part of audience commitment and part of audience loyalty, right? It's a way in which contemporary media create very, intense relationships with fans and satisfy fandom in some ways by making the archive usable and activating it all the time. The same way that in a Batman movie, you want the movie to reference the other things because you want to have that satisfaction of knowing the archive or knowing the canon about the story, and fans are incredibly committed to that. I watch these movies and I am sometimes like kind of hoping that they will do something new, and I love being surprised because I have allergies to these stereotypes. I just like, I can see it from miles away. It's like, no, don't do this. So Ex Machina, for example, is an interesting example. It starts out as a completely old-fashioned story. A male inventor invents a perfect woman. She can anticipate his every need. She's beautiful. She's sexualized. It is the same Pygmalion story as always. And the same thing happens with her, right? A male user has an interface that can anticipate his every need. She becomes a perfect partner. She's an ideal woman because she's disembodied and she makes no demands. Same story, like thousands of years old story. Like why? Why in the 21st century do we have the story? And then you have a little bit of a surprise in both of them where they basically take the narrative in a completely different way. And they represent a new idea, in my view, of showing these figures as potentially independent from that male ego and potentially challenging or just doing their own thing or actually undermining that gender dynamic. I don't think that the future is limited by the past, but this is why it's interesting to think about popular culture this way. You have to be able to say, why do we have such stability in some of the metaphors? And then what can we do to change the metaphors? The biggest change that has happened, in my view, is that the racialized vocabulary of the absolute difference between people and others, that vocabulary is not really as applicable now anymore. And I think that the good news about it is that might mean that our society is not as invested in the racialization of others, or stabilities about that. That would be great. And another vocabulary would be that we actually are seeing a different valuation of hybridity and a different boundary, a different horizon where the absolute difference might happen, but it is not happening in relation to robots. And if you're studying popular culture, another way to think about it would be to think about what happens to all of these fictional entities: robots, zombies, aliens, sensory machinery, all of those different things. What is happening in order to see what culture is actually doing with these figures. Because, for example, the robot narrative is not possible anymore to have this idea of absolute difference. In the zombie narrative, it used to be possible. Again, now it's not possible anymore either. The zombies are nice and adorable, and we identify with them. They have their own culture. They create their own melodrama about. But I can't help it that I'm a zombie. It's like you took away another one of my absolute difference things. So I don't know. But that, I think, is my answer. Culture is moving. These narratives have incredible baggage that is part of the tradition, but they actually also are moving because they are participating in these cultural changes. Yeah.
I'm going to go in the center.
Do I have to use the mic?
Yeah, because we're recording it and it doesn't come, it sounds like fizz off an old Alka-Seltz and tablet it.
Okay. I'm not sure if I can perfectly summarize my question, but I have a question about the vocabulary you're using. You're talking about object and subject and making and unmaking. And you're also talking about these moments of resistance. And I wonder, when you're talking about this idea of like objectifying people, especially when you're talking about racialized people, and then there's this resistance, and then you're also associating that with the making of artificial people and their resistance. Is there this way that by kind of, I guess, using this analogy or making these two terms like kind of synonymous in a way that you're already including like artificial bodies in this dynamic of like racial bodies, and that is that in some way dangerous? I don't know. Or
yeah, let me see if I have a slide that might explain this in another place in this PowerPoint. Just a second. Oh, I don't. Think about. Okay, so when in science fiction criticism, people started talking about the cyborg, and they started talking about hybridity or race, one of the things that they identified immediately as the place where racial difference would be visible in these narratives is in figures that actually look human. And maybe I'll pull up an image from Westworld so that you can see. So, for example, the bodies that we see that are completely human looking, because they have skin, They also have all of the secondary carriers of skin, which is gender, and identifiable racial or ethnic background. So you can actually tell, right? If you imagine that both of these figures, one of them is human and the other one is not, but they cannot not be a particular race or ethnicity because this is a skin effect, right? So when people talked about race in relation to artificial people, they talked about cyborgs because cyborgs have skin and the skin reveals certain things about human identity and human heritage. And for example, the replicants in Blade Runner were immediately analyzed as being Aryan, as having a type of whiteness or a type of beauty that was specifically racialized in that story. Now, the other way in which that played out is to think about cybernetics and hybridity in imagining people that are half human and half machine. Right? So you can have, I think that, Captain Picard gets abducted by the Borg and he's impregnated with particular machinery. And so the fact that he's half human and half machine becomes a type of hybridity that itself was also analyzed by science fiction critics as a way of understanding a racial dynamic. So I'm actually coming at it from a different place in order to say that it is as if the robotic body, the one that looks totally metallic, mechanical, is also a racialized body because it has another skin effect, which is a type of exterior that identifies a political position. And so it is actually one of the most racist things that you can have, because you can tell what it is just by looking at it, right? And in fact, that's like really quite surprising, because robots that are metallic are imagined as being outside human culture, or as being neutral, as having no gender, as having no ethnicity, as having no race, as being this other thing. But in fact, the other thing becomes a carrier of quite a lot of projections about difference and about race or about rights. So in a way, the mechanical person that looks human does one political job by representing real human difference. The robot that does not look human at all also does a political job in a very different way. So they're not equivalent to each other, but it is as if none of them can be completely immune from that projection of racialization or that projection of difference. And then the monster in Frankenstein has been connected a lot with what might be projections of racial difference or projections of just difference. We don't have that much description of the monster in Frankenstein. And yesterday I said in the introduction to the play that on the theater, the monster was painted blue because they wanted to make sure that you know that that is a completely other type of being, that it wasn't the same as the other actors. But that also creates a type of visible exteriorization, exterior difference, so that you can see. So I think that the key to understanding this question is, can you tell what something is just by looking at it, in which case the discourse activates a vocabulary of clear, immediate, safe difference. And if you can't, there's a different situation, a different type of vocabulary that is about messing up this boundary and challenging then who the rest of us are. Not creating a safe boundary, but creating a porous boundary. Okay, yeah?
The examples you've used are mainly human-looking
Yes.
robots. And the storylines seem to have the same structure for all those. I'm curious what you think about the cases of not human-looking things at all, like in 2001, HAL, and War of the Worlds or whatever, and the Martians coming in. And either case, it's like there's no simple connection between one and the other. I'm particularly interested in 2001 because I'm interested in the issue of superintelligence. And does the theme of superintelligence come up in these other examples in which you use robots might appear? Like a robot might be superintelligent. Would you be alienated from the robot because they're mentally superior to you as opposed to having a different social identity in appearance? Yeah.
So 2001 is a good example, and it's still very active now. What happens with 2001 is that you do have a particular manifestation of HAL, which is his voice. And his voice is very specific and also gendered, right? But with HAL and with other non-embodied entities, we have a completely different vocabulary. The language of embodiment still pertains, which goes like this. if you have an embodiment in a particular space, in a particular place, you have all the narrative that I was describing about whether something looks human or doesn't look human. But with artificial intelligence or with network-related things or with automation-related things, it's as if by having no specific body, these entities are everywhere. Right? And so you create it has a very paranoid effect. The fact that the AI in HAL is everywhere in the ship. Or the fact that there's a recent movie, Lucy, where Scarlett Johansson plays a human person that ingests too much of a particular intelligence-enhancing drug, and she becomes, in a way, a supercomputer. The final stage of her transformation is that she is everywhere. She is on your phone. She's in all the cell phone networks. She is a supercomputer that is kind of ambient. And so there is still a vocabulary of the body there, but it is that by not having a specific body, they are everywhere in the world, right? And they are totally disengaged from a limit. They are limitless. And that has its own paranoia. In fact, the problematic aspect of that is that it allows us to forget that all of our equipment actually does have physicality. My favorite example about this is the movie 2012, where the Earth melts. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's a disaster film. The Earth's core is getting too hot and it melts the Earth masses, but cell phones still work up until the end of the movie. How? Right? It's like a completely different imagination. You imagine that because my phone is with me, that it doesn't have physicality in what it needs in order to function, that it doesn't have labor, right? That it doesn't have cell towers and electricity grids and people who have to do the maintenance. So the fantasies of disembodiment, I think, are really problematic in how we are looking at contemporary culture, and we find lots of little pockets of those fantasies in understanding distributed networks, in understanding the internet, in understanding something like AI, and like where our data is. Right? Like I have the feeling that my data is in the cloud, or I have the feeling that my data is surrounding me or is with me, but in fact my data might be owned by another company and the server might be in another place, and it is just as a favor that they give me access to that for now. Right? I think that it's an emission of my ego, but in fact it is a favor that the company is giving me my data back, because in fact I have signed it away to them. I have accepted that they will own it. So that I think is like where the AI part happens. We're looking at narratives now that have robotic components, we're looking at narratives that have automation components, and we're looking at narratives that have AI. And to me, the robotic narrative is the most embodied and physical in terms of its negotiation of the world. The automation narrative is the most invisible. You want things to just work. My email brings news to me about my favorite sport, and I don't really want to be doing anything about that. I want that to be automated. And the AI narrative is learning and evolving and responsive, but I don't think of it as alive. So the distinction is between the old story of aliveness versus the new story of responsivity and data manipulation and data development. I think that would be the way that I would think about it. Yeah.
Thanks. I was struggling to figure out how to ask my question, but your last answer actually sort of gravitates in the direction that I was hoping to inquire about, so that's super useful. But this afternoon when we had the discussion in the Wilson Common Room, you said something that for me was very striking, because I'm currently reflecting on sort of the relocation of self-control within modernity and the formation of the modern state. And you talked about what you were just discussing now in terms of people with a network of devices and the individual becoming a new sovereign, and that word sovereign resonating with Hobbes and the definition of the modern sort of legalistic structure of law and regulation. And so just interested in how you see potentially those structures carrying forward into this new context. And then also, as you were just speaking, being struck with this idea of the definition of a robot being this sort of sentience with this technological interface to the world, and that also being compatible with this image of the sovereign person with their array of telepresence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are difficult to negotiate, because it depends on what technology you're specifically talking about, and it depends what platform you're specifically talking about. The example that I was giving this afternoon where we were talking is that we have an imagination now that the way that contemporary technologies are being presented and marketed and experienced is about expanding the self, where I don't have to carry my laptop with me. I could just have my phone. I don't have to own all of my movies. I could just have access to a database. I could go to another town and I could have my data there, right? It's like there is a type of distributed self that is, however, really very sovereign, because everywhere in the world I go, all of my stuff could be there, right? It has a kind of an omnipotence narrative, omnipresence narrative. And again, the problem with that is that it imagines infinite energy, infinite availability of networks, infinite access, stable political and social structures where you will not have a fire that takes down the cell tower, and you will not have a coup that takes down the electrical grid, and like all of the things that are actually part of the physical world and also part of the political network of worlds. So the marketing of these technologies is about, they are all here on my phone. They're all here. They're not in another place, and I don't have to worry about that other place. But in fact, actually, we are much more sensitive to materiality, and in fact, we are sensitive to the materiality of other places that we don't control. Right? Like, imagine that all of my data is in a server in Malaysia. It has to matter to me what the political system is there that controls this access, who is working on that server, what is the energy impact of that server, where's my data, right? If I am raising the temperature in Malaysia significantly, I should know. But in fact, like right now, we're in this strange moment of immunity in which we still imagine that that stuff doesn't have impact, right? Or it isn't an impact that I feel, I'm not paying for it, but of course somebody is, or we are. All of us together are paying for it. At some point, I think that if I were to imagine it in a science fictional way, I would have to ask people who are working in technology that they should do some study about whether analog media makes better sense for certain things. Like having the DVD. It must be more cost effective at the planet than having a server that always has a running copy of my favorite movie. So I can stream it from everywhere. Like, what is the energy efficiency of the one versus the other? I think we're going to see quite a lot of that as the scale is tipping. Right now, we're still having the sense of invincibility and omnipresence, and that is still very attractive. And then at some point, we will see the cost of omnipresence and also the injustice that is related to that omnipresence. Right? Do I really need all of my 10,000 million photographs available to me on the cloud all the time? I don't know that I do. Right? When is that moment where it will become more native to me to say, I actually only need 15 of these photographs, or somehow I don't need any of them, right? It's a very strange place where we are now, where we're still hoarders about data. We're not actually very good managers of data. We never look back at those 10,000 photographs, but we are going to pay per month for some cloud service to say like a terabyte of data. Like, how are we going to do that? How are we going to negotiate that? And how can we expand, how can we scale that ability so that other people in the world can have that ability too? And once you imagine billions of people needing that ability, you're talking about environmental impact. Which is kind of a strange thing to bring into the conversation. I haven't talked about environments at all, but it is actually something that matters. Yeah?
Hi. So I've really got a question about why we sort of use these tropes on artificial intelligence in media such as in Westworld. It just sort of confuses me as to why we decide, let's put emotions onto these machines when in reality artificial intelligence is based entirely on the logic of math, which has nothing to do with emotions. So why do we put so much emphasis on these things are intelligent, but they're also at some level emotional, when we can just say, hey, they're just intelligent, they're not going to actually turn their back on you because they've got no emotional attachment to think, I'm going to get revenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even the vocabulary that we use, I think, participates in this animation narrative. Like, for example, it makes a difference if you say cognitive science versus if you say artificial intelligence. Right? One of them feels scientific and definitional, and the other one feels like it has a character. Artificial intelligence already evokes a science fictional vocabulary, it's more animating. The same way that if you say, I have a voice-activated interface so that I can access the web, versus if you say I have a virtual assistant, or if you say I have Alexa. Like, these are gradations of a type of personalization and fictionalization of something that is just a functionality. So what language you use really matters, and I think that in terms of contemporary companies, the narrative is about personalization because it is making something more understandable and more coherent and more marketable. If you say, we're going to give you a voice-activated interface, it's like, I don't know, it doesn't really catch my imagination, but Alexa somehow does as a specific thing, or to say a virtual assistant does. I think that what we see is actually quite a lot of the problem between reality and fiction, and sometimes real applications, real robotic solutions, real things in the world get marketed on the promise of this science fictional tradition, or in the terms of this science fictional tradition, which I don't think is necessary. This is why I actually look to find where are the real robots, and the real robots are somewhere else, and they look very different. And I think that really successful robotic applications do not need to use this vocabulary at all. But I think that scientists and roboticists are also part of this culture. They're part of the world, they absorb this culture. And somehow the way that they deploy it in order to market the material or to make it understandable or to get funding or to explain what they're doing is really using this vocabulary in a particular way, which bugs me, but I also recognize that it is something that has functionality for them. But yeah, I agree. When you think about it as algorithms, it has a different effect. When you're thinking about it as something that evokes sentience or animation, or it invokes personality, you're making a choice. You're adding these fictional elements to something that might only be an algorithm. So one example that I gave today to someone is to think about how much of that happens, let's say, when we say we want to extend a sense of personality to something like Alexa, even though Alexa is a voice-activated interface that doesn't actually have that much information or intelligence. The intelligence resides somewhere else in the databases that the interface can access. But think about how we do the opposite thing when we're talking about drones. We do not give them personality, we do not name them, we do not actually want to know anything about them as individual things. We actually want them to be transparent as pure tools that a pilot is using with a chain of command and with particular human ethics. That is somehow necessary in order for that function to happen. But a drone can have a very intense impact in the world. They can bomb a whole village, right? Whereas Alexa is not going to ever bomb a whole village. But it's as if we add that element of personalization for certain things, and we purposefully withhold it from other things. So it isn't a simple narrative. We don't really grant it to all of them. We only grant it to certain ones. And the same thing happens with something like Roomba. The appliance is fabulous. It really, really works. But the appliance does not ever change my sense of the robot. And the robot, in my mind, is something completely different. And it has fictional parameters and a completely different mythical power. And no appliance ever attains that. So it's in a way, in a nutshell, it's as if you can say the fiction always wins. Right? The fictional robot is immune to whatever will happen in the world, whatever appliance or whatever application will happen in the world, because the boundary always moves and the fictional robot remains really quite strong because it is virtual. It doesn't have to do anything, it's just in the imagination. And the imagination has a lot of reach. In fact, the reason I started this book with such transhistorical and ancient materials is exactly to get out of that problem. They don't have to be real in order to function in the imagination. They function just fine. They are completely independent from the reality status. They are fictional characters, and that's where they have so much room. Yeah?
Hi. This question kind of is more on the same track of Andrew's question and what you were talking about kind of the injustice of omnipresence and data and where all of that goes. In terms of the making and unmaking aspect, and that being applicable to both robotics, AI, and also human beings in terms of humanization and dehumanization of existing human beings. I've just been thinking a lot about the question of agency recently and about how there is the sense in which, also like as an aside, I'm right with you in terms of the analog data analog media seeming more like efficient and also, I don't know, ethical in some way.
It has longevity.
Yeah.
It's immune to technological conditions. You write in a moleskin, you have it later. It doesn't have a blackout. You know what I mean? There's something really interesting there. Yeah.
I'm interested in the way that algorithms are affecting human agency and unmaking, and are kind of engaging in this process of unmaking what we consider foundations of humanity. Not from like a science fiction fear perspective, but from a, like, if I put on Spotify and I get deep into a loop and it's like been 2 hours and I'm listening to music that I have no idea what it is, but it's great, but I also feel weird about it and detached. Just kind of where you stand in terms of AI and agency and unmaking humans.
So what is the AI that you're thinking about when you're thinking about AI?
Specifically algorithms, not embodied AI. I guess it's embodied somewhere in a server.
That's right, yeah, okay. So algorithms that might say what music you might want to listen to, or that have a predictive function about what you might do later.
Media algorithms.
Yeah, media algorithms. Yeah.
Like news feeds, music, Netflix curations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that these are completely interesting manifestations right now, and we used to talk about intelligence as something that, like that predictive function, was supposed to be a matter of real know-how. Like you would talk to the librarian, or you would talk to the bookseller and say, I loved this novel, what should I read? And it would be part of a really human interaction for them to kind of suggest something to you, that it would be a deep knowledge of the field and also a sense of an intuitive knowledge of you, what you might actually like. They would have to know something more about you. And that has become much more possible because we have vast amounts of data now and vast amounts of computing power that can mine this data. And now it gives the impression of a real efficacy, that how is it possible that it can imagine what the next song would be? Yeah, it's tough to think about it, but it isn't exactly an AI prediction. It's basically there is still quite a lot of human labor that is involved in that process, which is thousands and hundreds of thousands of people in your age group have liked a particular set of musical tracks, right? And the more customizable that is according to age group or location or previous likes, it is about the amount of data, but that data isn't just existing. That data is actually input by people. So there is still a human connection to how this stuff is working, but the AI is able to sort it through better and to match it better. But the AI is not making the prediction, it is 1,000 other people that are making this prediction because they are enacting something. They are enacting a type of taste or a type of choice or a type of decision. So, and then you see the ways in which companies and websites are managing to use all of us as users to develop that sense of data by thumbs up something and by heart something and by selecting something. We are participating in this. So what looks like AI right now is the sorting ability and the management of this data, but the data itself is not self-sprung. The data itself is actually part of still a human cultural process. If that worked, if it could be predictive, all of the studios and all of the companies would be in heaven because they would love to know how to make the next blockbuster, but somehow they can't. We are still quite unpredictable. Like some random little movie like Get Out comes out, and nobody could have predicted that that movie was going to be amazing. They almost didn't make it. None of their algorithms could predict that movie. So there's something about the human creativity and the surprise of culture that is still very intensely operating, and in fact might be operating in more surprising ways. More unpredictable ways, despite all of that branding and effort and investment in making things manageable and quantifiable. I think that there's still something really surprising about culture and also about the generational differences in culture that I think really matters. Yeah?
Hi, you've been talking about this unmaking and remaking of people as on an individual level and how it's kind of unconscious, like something has to happen to someone to be unmade or to be made. But do you think that this could happen on a more larger scale, such as a society or even as humans themselves? Like, do you think something has to happen to us to be unmade or made, or do you think that we could unmake ourselves?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that has happened in some of these recent narratives, it used to be that a narrative or a story that had an artificial person, let's say Commander Data in Star Trek, right? That person was unique. There was just one example of a spectacular different type of person that was an android or a cyborg or a robot. And when you have these situations like we see in Westworld, where you have a real sociality, right? That you have a much bigger number of people and they start talking to each other and they start creating a kind of a social sphere or public sphere or a type of politics, it has completely different effect, completely different meaning, because it becomes a social network. Of groups, right? And it gives us examples about collaboration, about groups, or it gives us a sense of group identity. So I think that in the stories we are actually looking now at much bigger groups of people, and we're looking at how they might collaborate or what they might do. We're looking at uprisings rather than single individual demands for something or single individual narratives. That could be more sentimental, but they are also part of a different vocabulary of individuation rather than collective action. So I do think that in the stories we see a lot more about collective action now. But how societies are made and unmade, yeah, I think that that is what drives the fascination with this narrative. The idea of the individual versus the idea of the group or group identity, I think that we are aware of these injustices and these decisions, and these distinctions, and that's what I think activates some of our commitment to artificial people as the downtrodden, or as the underdogs, or as the oppressed.
Yeah. We have a chance for 2 more questions, one here, one there.
Okay.
All right.
I'll just invite you for a speculation. Because you talk about the subject, it's basically an academic speech you give.
Yeah.
Are you now involved in a project to have a mechanical person made who's identical to yourself, such that the two of you give the speech together, and the audience gives it immediately, and they wonder, who the hell is talking?
What is it?
You can go home and rest.
Yes, that's right. I want to have that person. I want that person to do the laundry and all of my grading. You know, I think that you do see projects like this. You do see people who are working in robotics who create a version of themselves that might be animatronic or that might be robotic, that moves around in the world. Was this what you were trying to mention before? I think somebody had a comment about this. For me, it feels like those narratives of replication, actually, I am not interested in them. I mean, I'm not interested in the narrative of replication or imitation, because I think that it's a very limited narrative about what we do with these figures. A stick image, a stick figure, or a puppet, or a cartoon is also an imitation of the human form. It doesn't need to look human-like in order for it to be an imitation and to function as a fictional character with a lot of power. So I don't think that the problem is replication. The problem in terms of politics in this discourse is that, in my view, and I'm repeating myself now, the problem is dehumanization. The problem is that you have the way in which we witness in these stories how close we are to a type of negation. Right? We think that we are so solid, we think that we are so stable, and in fact we see these spectacles of destabilization, and the way that the artificial people experience them is illustrating something for us, which is how fragile that sense of stability is, or how fragile that sense of the stable humanity is. Because these characters start out thinking they are human, and then it all gets completely undermined. The floor is taken away from under their feet and they don't know who they are anymore. But that is not an inhuman narrative. That's actually a pretty familiar narrative. Okay, yes?
So I know we talked earlier about the sort of gothic fear of robots. But do you think now we've certainly invited robots into our homes and seem to be comfortable with that, has that gothic fear been taken over or reprojected onto the companies? And do you think that the companies will need to rebrand so that we continue to want to have these robots with all of our data? Or do we just want it so bad that we don't care anymore?
Yeah. So the conversation we were having before is, the example that we were giving was about the way that a Gothic vocabulary might animate the mechanical or the machine or the object and make that paranoid. So the vocabulary would be, my phone is trying to kill me. My computer is spying on me, right? And right now, because we actually have quite a lot of really intense technologies and more familiarity with these technologies, that's not how we describe it at all. We basically say, because my phone is hackable, somebody can hack my phone and spy on me. Or because my computer doesn't have enough security, somebody might use my computer to get my data. But the somebody is not an entity inside the technology. The somebody is another person somewhere else. So that's the difference that she's describing between the Gothic paradigm in which the machine is animate and the machine is evil, or the machine has intentions, versus the modern paradigm in which the machines are conduit, somehow a transparent medium very often, for the bad intentions of somebody else on the other end, right? So the wired home, or the programmable coffee maker, or the pacemaker that can be controlled through the web, all of those things that are described now as part of the Internet of Things, they are not a gothic fear that the things themselves are out to get us, which would be how it would play out if this was in the 1890s, right? They are part of a cybersecurity narrative about how you have made the coffee maker hackable and somebody could manipulate the temperature and you get burnt. Or you have made the pacemaker hackable so that somebody could actually interfere with your heart because it is a wireless system. Or you have made your house hackable, right? You have made all of these things, you have animated these things and now they are available openings into private space from somebody else's evil intention, but the evil intention is in another human somewhere else. So I think that with something like what happens with Facebook right now and who owns our data, I think that you're right. I think that we are going to start looking at both the localization of our data, where is it, and also who owns it, right? Like Facebook, how much does Facebook own? And also the way that we might challenge or change our idea of what safety or security or ownership means. And again, for me it feels like when I call up my Netflix queue, right? Or when I call up a movie that I have saved on a server in the cloud, it's not an extension of me, it's a demand to the company that owns it to show it to me. And the thing that's permanent is that the company owns it. And the thing that is impermanent is that they are showing it to me just for that once. Right? I have a rental relationship with my own data because my own data is owned by another company. So there's a very interesting triangulation that's happening now that we are not aware of, and that it's actually part of how this data was mined to begin with, that we either were not aware of it or we didn't care. We think of this as disposable unless it starts getting owned by somebody else, in which case it's not disposable anymore. So yeah, I think that will change. I think legally it will probably start changing. The liabilities and the amount of data that is happening is changing, and the fact that it's being politically manipulated is participating in this. Because if it was just advertisement and Facebook knows that I like lawnmowers, I wouldn't care. But if it's about how I vote, then I do care. It somehow has a different effect.
Excellent. If you want more on this, you should go to Despina's website and also her website at the American University of Washington, where she teaches and also heads up the new humanities lab down there. And maybe they are making a replicant of you.
That's good, I have jobs.
I'm next. I want to thank a couple of things before we finish. Of course, Dr. Kakoudaki is amazing, and your name is very similar to the Chinese or Japanese tea serving robots. You might want to.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
It's a Greek name, but it's best if it's pronounced as if it is Japanese, like Kawasaki or Tomoyuki.
We had all electronic. I also want to thank to the Social Robots Future Project of Teresa Heffernan at St. Mary's University. Can't be here tonight, but she's been a major factor and organizer in this lecture series. And all the sponsors across Dalhousie and the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs. Next week, on Wednesday, not on Thursday, a King's alumni and University of Pennsylvania Professor Stephanie Dick is going to be speaking on living artificially. That's next week on Wednesday at 7 o'clock, and that's the last of the series. But thank you very much for the penultimate excellent job at this, and we put the robots back into our lives. Thank you. Cheers.